Oh yeah.
Just gonna hit record and we'll just go. All right. Well, on a world spinning its way to damnation amidst the fear and despair of a broken human race, who is left to fight for what's good and pure? That's right. It's time for Night Rule. I am Isaac. I'm joined by my good friend, Professor Adnan Husain of Queen's University. Hello, Adnan. Thank you for joining us for Night Rule.
Oh, it's a delight. Glad to be with you.
So I know you just came off another podcast talking about the current situation in Palestine and Israel and the occupied territories. I mean, the nomenclature being so hard to pin down, I think, is really emblematic of a lot of the issues here. Um, I mean, we've been people have been talking about it a lot. I talked about it with Hannah Feldman last episode, which I thought was a pretty good conversation. I think it's frustrating to see the lack of nuance in a lot of the conversations that's out there, the lack of historical knowledge, and also people kind of having succumbed to some extent to a certain media narrative that has really just become, it's learned by rote, it's paint by number, it's something that's been passed down from the top down. But I think there's a lot of interesting things in terms of people speaking out and new voices kind of being unafraid to emerge and comment on the situation. Where do you think we're at right now with this kind of, as we kind of look at this unsteady truce that's kind of taken hold?
Well, I'm not a prognosticator or a political scientist to really talk about whether I think the truce will hold or how this is being used by the different parties to shape their positioning vis-a-vis one another, or the way some people want to talk about it, which is who gained the most out of it and so on. I
Yeah.
mean, I think we can do some analysis of that, but I think what it is really an opportunity finally for the world to put some effort into a genuine solution to an abiding problem that could be characterized as at least 73 years running. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so I mean, this hiatus in active conflict, the situation is fundamentally one of oppression and inequality, and that's not going away unless we do something, about it. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that there's not a lot of nuance in the media and public discourse about the situation. I think sometimes many
There's too
people
much.
are struggling to
Yeah.
try and demonstrate nuance. There's a bit
Mhm.
of a both sidism that plagues a lot of the coverage when it's at its best, often.
Yeah, I've definitely heard people push back. Like I think I myself said something along the lines of, it's complicated, and Hannah pushed back on the last episode saying, on one hand it is, on the other hand it's very simple. And I think
That's
that's a
right.
that's a really good point. That's a really good perspective right now, as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
and
mean, there are some truths to the situation that just have to be recognized, and I think we get into complications when we try and avoid confronting the full consequence of that truth, and that's one of the obfuscating elements of this discussion, I think. And so, one of the truths of it that's simple is just that you have a settler colonial situation that means the suppression of one people for the privilege of another. That's a condition of injustice. And as a result, there will not be security if that's what, for example, Israel and its citizens are looking for. If they're looking
which I'm sure
for,
it is, among
yeah,
other things. Yeah.
among other things. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the problem is that um, they want a kind of security that guarantees and preserves a certain privilege and dominance. And if you
A
just want
supremacy. They
exactly,
want like they're going to guarantee their supremacy, but their security via supremacy, which seems to me
yes,
the ultimate kind of poison chalice. You know what I
exactly,
mean? Because
exactly,
if if you're living in a society that lives in constant fear of being the subject of another genocide, you
yeah,
will inevitably, like, Rod Serling could have written a Twilight Zone episode about this 50 years ago, and it would have been totally understood by everybody that if you're fixated on being a victim of a genocide, if you have a recent cultural memory of a horrific genocide, but if and you're living your life based on that basis, you're guaranteed to commit genocide against someone else to to try and achieve some sort of feeling of peace, some sort of peace of mind. You know, that's
Yeah.
I feel like that's wired into the process going in. You know, it
Well, I
seems
mean,
really intuitive to me.
yeah, that's right. I mean, it's even a kind of strange way of recycling trauma, you know? I mean, obviously, this is a state that was founded in the ashes of the Holocaust, you know, that it was made possible in some ways because of one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity, a genocide of the Jews in Europe. And that's almost as if that trauma, because the way in which it was processed by Europe, um,
Through
in
its own prism of wider spread anti-Semitism, I would really
that's
argue as
right,
well.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know that the solution that was envisioned is one where Europe and the West never really took responsibility, despite, of course, subsequent self-examinations and recognition that it was a horrible crime. You know, the precipitating events was the exclusion of Jews from full political citizenship. And it is precisely that Zionism was seen as an antidote to, which was European anti Semitism, the historic oppression and exclusion of the Jews. Um, and so it's almost like that trauma ends up, uh, being the Palestinians to bear and to suffer under because Europe and the West never really confronted the fact that the responsibility was theirs and that
Mm.
Zionism really was an attempt at imitating European nationalism in a period and in a context where it was no longer appropriate, if it ever had been appropriate, to have this ethno
Oh, it's certainly out of
national.
date by now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
In a lot of ways, I was saying this to a friend. I feel like there's a few spots in the world where World War II and its kind of consequences are still spinning out. And one of them is Israel and Palestine. Another would be North and South Korea. And to a
Hmm.
certain extent, I think we have to think about what it means to truly end the legacy of that war
Hmm.
totally, and whether we've really done that work as a globe and as a species. Because I don't think we have. I mean, it's really like it's also the pinnacle of a type of kind of like global north versus global south type dynamic where I mean usually that's bound mostly and obviously it can be expressed in a lot of racialized terms. You think about the Congo and King Leopold, I think it was, in Belgium and whatnot, but
Yes.
usually the global south has had to bear the brunt of the avarice and the greed of the global north. They haven't actually had to also bear the brunt of some kind of spiritual crime. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? There's no other case in which non-Europeans have been subjugated to literally having to pay the price on like a cultural, spiritual level almost for the crimes of Europeans. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
very bizarre, it's a very bizarre extension of like an already existing dynamic to like a whole new disturbing level, I think.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a very interesting point and an interesting perspective on it because I was thinking of it pretty much as a kind of outgrowth of European settler colonialism as the solution to European anti Semitism and
Mm,
racial and religious bigotry.
mm.
And it's so interesting that you're pointing out that this legacy of World War II is still with us in various ways, and this is a real example of that. It made me remember a piece of work written by Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, that he wrote in the 1950s, right during the era of decolonization, when in Asia and Africa nations were throwing off colonialism,
Leaving the
fighting.
British Commonwealth and yeah.
That's yes, it's exactly this era, and he wrote this book, Discourse on Colonialism, and he fits in with quite a number of great Caribbean anti-colonial thinkers. Frantz Fanon comes a little bit later, but is part of that sort of generation, and you have Black Jacobins.
Mhm, mhm.
You have so many of these wonderful works that are
Yeah, that's
produced.
CLR Lewis, right?
CLR James, yes,
Sorry,
CLR
CLR
James.
James.
That's
Sorry.
right.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Exactly. So, that's a very productive period of time. And he wrote in this discourse on colonialism about how, everyone was trying to make, and so much reminds us of Trump and the Trump era of Trump. Everyone was trying to make it seem like it was completely atypical. It's, not a normal political phenomenon,
Mm,
Trumpism, Nazism, saying, oh, this is an aberration. And
mm,
what he says in this is people act with this, surprise, and they become very indignant when you point out to them that, in fact, before they were the victims of Nazism, they were its accomplices, he says, because they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted upon them,
mhm,
when, it was directed at non-Europeans through colonialism. And he makes this link between colonialism and fascism, that they're essentially the same
mm,
thing. The difference
mm,
is that fascism also included other Europeans as, subordinate to a
mm,
German, nationalism.
mm.
Um,
It's interesting.
but that the same kinds of violence, the same kind of denigration, the same kind of dehumanization was unleashed in savage forms as barbarism against, the non-white world, the non-European world. And so this kind of pseudo-humanism, he sort of argues that this pseudo-humanism has, especially of liberals wringing their hands about Nazism when they gave a pass to these global kind of forms of savage violence. That the rest of the world is having to, and the rest of the world, you think about what happened during World War II and in previous wars, where so many colonial troops ended up fighting for the liberation of Europe from Nazism. So you had all these Algerian, West African
Hmm.
troops that fought from French colonies, fought for the liberation of France against Nazism, against racism. And then what happens when they come home? They're denied their political rights, their social
Hmm.
rights, and economic rights, even though they fought for freedom.
Well,
Freedom.
that's subjecthood in the colonial era, right? I mean, like
That's right.
literally, it's like chattel slavery in another guise. Ultimately, when you think about it on a certain level.
That's right. And it's so interesting because, the same thing happened with black soldiers, African American soldiers who fought in
Yeah.
Europe. And then they come back to the Jim Crow South and not
And
allowed.
they had to scramble like the 47th Airborne or something to stop like rioting and mob violence from taking place, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's interesting that you say that those legacies are still there. We think a lot of time has passed, but in many ways there are some interesting parallels with that period in that time.
Well, and you even look at like things for like in Russia, for example, the legacy of like the Great War, as they would call it, or but I'm not sure what they called it in Russia, but like World War II has a prominent like historical and cultural legacy in a place like Russia,
Oh
very
yeah.
much to this day, for sure, on a level that most people here don't really understand, I think. Um,
Well, people don't understand what Russia, well, the Soviet Union suffered, in winning that war. I
mm,
mean, we talk about U.S. D-Day, the beaches of
yeah,
Normandy and so on, but
but
really,
Russia lost more than all the other allies combined. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Now here's another question for you. I've been wanting to ask you this. So I mean, we know that Israel itself was born out of this historical context when the Holocaust had just happened. You know, one of probably the most brutal um, crime against humanity that we can ever imagine. There's also the context of European and American anti-Semitism and this desire to maybe kind of remove the problem, the quote unquote problem from their perspective and move the Jewish diaspora out of their own countries. So if I mean if you can say then that there's been a component, certainly not the only component, but a component of supporters of Israel that's steeped in anti-Semitism. I mean, it's interesting to me, right? Because we certainly live in an era where in the media and whatnot and in private conversation, you will be labeled as anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel. But I want to wonder if we need to move to a world where people are criticized for being anti-Semitic when they support Israel too much,
Well,
especially in its crimes against the Palestinians as well, which I think we all know only serves to further inflame tensions. I mean, let's be real here. Like we're all adults.
well, yes. I mean, okay, you're raising, something that will sound really provocative in the way that one can frame it, but absolutely you have to look at the real consequences and the real sources. So, currently, I think with changes that have taken place in the diasporic Jewish community that are very critical of Israel's policies and are concerned about the affiliation and the identification of Jews with, Israel, are questioning a lot of the key principles and presumptions of Zionism. And it's to the extent that many of the Jewish, the Israeli right wing that has typically relied upon the Jewish diaspora in the United States in particular as a major source of support, think that that community in some ways is unreliable now because there's been so much questioning, particularly the younger generation,
Mhm.
that their real allies and reliable allies are the Christian Zionists, the conservative evangelical right wing.
Well, and this comes to it. I mean, like, in
And
how
those
much
are,
anti-Semitism is present in that community. Let's be honest. It's,
that's,
I mean,
well,
it may not be fully expressed, but it's latent. It's clear. You know, I mean,
it's, I mean, I,
there's these are people that don't respect the faith of Jewish people. They don't respect Judaism. They consider it kind of just a kind of signpost along the road to Christianity,
right.
subservient to Christianity. I mean, like, if there's one group that has committed more crimes against the Jewish people over centuries, it's fundamentalist Christians. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
speaking to a medieval scholar. We know
Yeah.
this, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, go all the way back, and think of the category of the Jew in Christian thought and how it metamorphosed into a real anti Judaism that you could say was proto anti Semitism with pogroms, blood libel, but also the massacres against the Jews. Every time the crusade was being preached from 1095 in the First Crusade, the Second Crusade in the 1140s, that accompanying this hegemonic colonialist the first of these settler colonialisms in Palestine, okay, from Europe, that it was always accompanied by massacres of Jews in Europe as um, allies of the Muslims, as enemies of Christ, just as the Saracens and the Muslims are enemies of Christ, and in this apocalyptic or messianic atmosphere
Mm.
of restoring a kind of kingdom of heaven in the Holy Land, avenging Christ, that the place of Jews in that, once history is culminated, this is the sort of idea, is that
Mm.
before the end times, yes, you have to tolerate them because they literally preserve the Hebrew Bible, which is
Mm.
understood in Christian thought as the Old Testament, and which provides the evidence for Christians of the truth of Christianity, right? So you have to
Mm.
keep them around. They should be subordinate. They should know their place. They are servants of Christians, etc. But you want them around because they provide wonderful proof of the truth of Christianity, the prophecies of the New Testament,
Yeah,
etc.
which
But the
rhymes. Go ahead.
culmination of that is their elimination ultimately at the end of times. Then all
Exactly.
bets are off. And these Christian Zionists of today,
That's what they
uh,
believe. They fucking
that's
believe that
exactly
shit,
what they
man.
believe.
They don't care about these people that live in this region. To them, they throw them in the meat grinder so they can live out their fucking messianic end of days rapture fantasy where they can finally go to heaven and have some fucking good sex for the first time in their goddamn lives. I'm sorry,
Well, there
but
you
it's
go.
disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's disgusting that geopolitically your ideology would be based on your own self-aggrandizing fantasy of Christ coming down from heaven in your lifetime to give you a high five. I'm sorry, it's disgusting and childish and
Well,
dangerous.
it is, and but what's interesting is that they may believe it, but those who manipulate this for geopolitical purposes today, I mean, what is that? That is
Yeah.
just such bizarre.
It's real politic on
This
a really fucked up level, is what it is. It's funding
exactly, and that's
Wahhabists, same
fanning
people that fund
anti-Semitism.
Wahhabists and all other people,
That's right.
the original Mujahideen. I mean, it's all, uh, you know, like no foresight, no ability, just one step forward, two steps back.
But
Um,
I do think there is some good news in all of this. So if we're saying what is the state of the situation, I mean, some new elements in what typically appears to be the cyclical, every few years, bloodletting in this cycle, some new elements of this. One, and in some ways you might say that this would be a rather controversial perspective, but I heard Jim Zogby mention this.
the famous pollster.
The famous pollster, Arab American scholar and academic and commentator, he pointed out that up until Hamas started sending its rockets after its deadline passed for the end of this Sheikh Jarrah ethnic cleansing of that neighborhood and of the assaults on the Al Aqsa complex during the month of Ramadan. That up until that time, all the attention was really on what was taking place in Jerusalem, solidarity that was being expressed among the Palestinian population that are Israeli citizens within 1948, and that this in some ways put it back on track with the typical cycle, of Gaza being bombarded and, Israel has to defend itself and so on. And it kind of took attention off of what really had inflamed passions globally for justice for Palestine and solidarity for Palestine, is seeing these worshippers being gassed and attacked and so on, and the plight of people who have already been made refugees once being kicked out of their homes, a second time. So that sort of took attention away. So I would say one thing, however, is that was a mobilizing moment, broadly speaking. And so that's interesting. That's important that a lot of these countries like the UAE, Bahrain, other of these corrupt Gulf monarchies that have made normalization, treaty agreements with Israel in ways that have abandoned the plight of the Palestinians are now going to be facing a little bit more pressure, I think,
That
from
is
this worldwide community.
that is a really interesting perspective, because it's true. Like certainly the last 4 or 5 years, probably a little bit longer, there has been a very slow creep of, while paying the same or a requisite
Yes.
amount of lip service to the Palestinian
Yeah.
cause, really doing everything you can behind the scenes, various states in the region to play your hand, that you're willing to play ball, basically. But
Exactly.
you're saying
Yeah.
that might reverse this trend. That's really interesting to me.
Well, what I'm
Or at least
suggesting
abate it.
is that, yeah, is at least that there is a mobilization, popularly speaking, that people are invested again in the Palestinian condition and situation that had been ignored. I mean, look, even the March of Return, which was peaceful, nonviolent, attempt to dramatize the right of return and the plight of the people under siege in Gaza. Hundreds of people were being killed, just shot, mown down at the border fence, as it's called. And to be honest, it didn't really, outside of typical Palestine solidarity circles, really gain much attention. This, however, gained global attention. People started caring again about the situation. The second really new thing I think that has to be confronted here is the Israeli Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in 1948 protesting in solidarity, and
General
what
strike.
happened? Yeah,
Yeah.
what happened in Lod? The kind of unwillingness to continue to take the ultra right wing fascistic death to Arabs, sort of slogans and hegemony, lying down, and to exhibit solidarity with Palestinians in other conditions. I do get and understand that their condition and situation as a small minority in the a Jewish state was quite different than those under occupation in territories taken in the 1967 war or in Gaza. And so naturally, they would have slightly different interests. They would have different histories in the post 1948 period that would condition their culture, their political environment. However, despite all of that, that was quite courageous to begin to demonstrate. It happened one other time that I recall, which was in the first Al Aqsa Intifada, right? Or this you could call as almost a second Al Aqsa Intifada that was emerging, or you could call it the Eid al-Fitr, a war that was starting to break out. But the first time when Ariel Sharon took hundreds of police and military personnel in order to assert sovereignty in a very provocative way in the Al-Aqsa complex in that area, it elicited a huge response among Palestinians in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, and an intifada that was violently put down in which there was huge losses, just absolute brutality. During that same time period, there were major demonstrations by Palestinians living inside Israel, and I believe 12 or 13 of them were shot, and it was really quite momentous. That was a sign of some kind of solidarity beginning, but that sort of disappeared, was suppressed for a long time. And it's again the same invasion of the Al Aqsa, that symbolic, freighted, an important symbol of, Palestinian potential sovereignty. And of course, of religious sanctity for, Muslims in particular, was again a trigger for expressing a new movement for equality and justice by Palestinians inside of Israel. That's something kind of new, and I think it's quite scary for Israeli society to think about. It's a little bit like the Black Lives Matter, and I think I've seen a lot of commentators who have suggested that the popularity of pro-Palestine solidarity movements globally, but particularly in places like the U.S., Canada, and in Western Europe, that are emerging, particularly among young people, has something to do with the recognition of brutality, forms of police and military suppression that are based in racism and ethno or religious exclusion, that we witnessed in Black Lives Matter, that has opened a lot of people's eyes to the plight of the Palestinians in ways that is different. Something
Well,
is different.
I mean, there were probably Israeli security experts training police forces across America the last decade or two. Like, I mean, the security industry,
Hmm.
like Israel is a superpower in that as well as being a regional
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting though, like when you bring up the Al-Aqsa, I feel as though the religious dimension of this conflict is very much overstated by some.
Absolutely.
And that I find that problematic because it really serves to just essentialize the problem, to reify it, to make it seem like it's some sort of blood feud that's gone back thousands of years, completely just throwing all the history of multi-faith, multi-denominational, multicultural cultures in that region and other adjacent regions, as the people just behave as though that never happened.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
while at the same time, you can recognize that, a religious site can have a cultural significance beyond just the religious significance, and that especially if it's a component of a besieged group of people, it can really become a flashpoint. Is that really what's going on here more with Alexa in this
Oh,
particular conflict?
absolutely.
Would you say? Yeah.
This is not a religious conflict in any way. However, there are religious symbols that matter beyond even just the Palestinians. So I'm not saying that is causal of the framework politically that we're dealing with. The issue here is clearly one of settler colonialism, dispossession, and occupation that is a political, question. It's a political question entirely. However, in terms of the symbols and cultural values and identifications that might motivate people within such a circumstance to action, or to create lines of affiliation, of solidarity and sympathy, those can be religious symbols. And I think for Muslims globally to see places that they regard as holy being violated because of Israeli occupation, control, and domination, and expropriation and dispossession of Palestinians, it comes to hit home in ways that perhaps just seeing, a people suffering oppression, you know, doesn't motivate people always to action in quite the same visceral sort of way. And that's why I actually was sort of surprised at some of the obvious excesses that, in this era of media and during Ramadan. Okay, like, look, this is the wrong time if you wanted to express sovereignty over this site. The wrong time to do it is when all of this attention is being paid. People globally are, engaged in religious activities, and you're seeing people at prayer being gassed and attacked and beaten and arrested and so on. It seemed very brazen to me. It seemed that there was a level of audacity and of self confidence that you could act with impunity that was leading Israeli policymakers, leaders, and officials under the influence of this extreme right wing, that has become part of government, of, absolute fascistic religious racists like the Meir Kahane sort of group. These people have now, with this inexorable and constant, ever shifting further and further right of the Israeli government, are now actually part of government. And I think that has emboldened them. The era of Trump, moving of the U.S. embassy and official recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, all of these steps have encouraged a real action, sense of impunity, right? That there's no way we will be held responsible and we can do whatever we want. And I think they really went very far in transgressing and miscalculating a more sober and subtle, not to say that they've ever been all that subtle, but this seemed like a step that was, pushed by, it was a kind of mistake that I wouldn't have expected to make. And, it was so egregious and so obvious.
Yeah.
And I think that has inflamed the situation
Hmm.
with consequences that could undermine a lot of years of successful, careful diplomatic negotiations with these agreements with the UAE, and finding ways to isolate Palestinians in world affairs, and any of the sympathy that used to be there. A lot of that work, I think, has been undone. Um, and the scales have dropped from many people's eyes, I think, yet again.
Now, one thing that I think also people get hung up on is the whole question of the Palestinian Authority versus Hamas. Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen. Mazen, is it Mazen or
Yes,
Mazen?
Abu Mazen. Yeah.
Mazen, and then obviously, I don't even know who the leader of Hamas is. I mean, they're kind of like, they're not really. It's so this is the thing. Like, I think people don't realize that through the history of the Palestinian Authority, for one, is quite problematic. And at this point, really, I think I heard them say on Chapo Trap House that, like, really, in a lot of ways, the Palestinian Authority doesn't exist outside of Mahmoud Abbas's office.
Hmm.
And ultimately, they're kind of the jailer of the West Bank, in that they derive all their authority from Israel, and they're there to, like, provide security and clamp down on dissidents in the West Bank.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of view it as they're kind of a branch of the tradition of Arab nationalism that goes back quite a ways. That's really kind of, its day is past in a lot of ways, and you could even say that in this context, this Arab nationalist party becoming weaker and weaker and weaker over time, creating a political vacuum that's then filled by
Hmm.
political Islam. I mean, really, that's much more the dynamic we're seeing here, right? And I think it's really difficult for people to get over the fact that, like, well, Hamas is horrible, quote unquote, in their minds, but the Palestinian Authority is fine if only we can negotiate with them, because it's not as though Israel is ever going to negotiate with either of them, first of all. Plus, I
Hmm.
mean, if you go back, Israel not only supported Hamas in the early days, but if I'm not
Oh, yeah.
mistaken, they created them, didn't they?
Well, I wouldn't say that they created them, in the sense that this is a wing, or a manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood movement that you have across the
Well, they
Arab and
supported them a
Islamic
great
world.
deal in the early
But
days
they,
because they
yes, that
wanted to create a schism within the Palestinian movement. They wanted to have
exactly.
warring
They wanted to
factions.
fracture. Well, I mean, if you just think of it this way, I mean, the
What,
United
what are
States
we
was
talking about?
also
We're talking about it right now. Palestinian, Joe Biden saying, "I will not negotiate with Hamas, but I will negotiate with the Palestinian Authority." Like, that process of dividing the movement is still playing out in our very words right
Oh,
now.
of course, of course. And, the whole point, though, here is that the U.S. has historically, so why wouldn't Israel also, figure that it could exploit a religious based movement to undermine and divide a secular nationalist liberation movement? I mean, this is what happened. Of course, we know, the deep history of U.S. involvement with jihadism in Afghanistan that led to the
Absolutely.
emergence of these radical, movements. So that has been a technique during the entire Cold War, during the era of, secular socialist liberation movements, that the surest policy by capitalist U.S. empire was to try and find religious groups that they could pit against those other populist uh, political formations. And so you see the same kind of thing happening early on in Israel's support of Hamas as a counterweight to the PLO. And its affiliated secular nationalist, anti-Zionist struggles.
Yeah.
So yes, this is the situation: is that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, through the course of the Oslo Accords, has lost any real popular legitimacy, has been completely ineffective in advocating in a principled fashion for Palestinian human rights, and has essentially become irrelevant as a political force, not, of course, as um, a network for distributing, the paltry resources
Mm,
that come through in foreign aid as the only legitimate,
mm,
partners for Western aid organizations, UN organizations, governments, and so on. So they can still pass on some of the largesse, in its network of patronage. But when it comes to actually representing Palestinian, aspirations and hopes politically, they are just the franchise, as you put it, sort of jailer of the occupation. I mean,
yeah.
that's really what they've amounted to, and that has been obvious for years and
Years,
years.
years
And
and years and years and years.
that's
Yeah.
right. And it's just a sort of stultified, calcified, autocratic, organization that, recently refused, shut down the elections. Um,
I mean,
Abu Mazen has
we should
not won
say
a genuine election in
in
years.
years. The thing
Years.
is, I mean, to be honest, it's probably hard to. Like it was clear for a while there was some effort there. Say when Abu Mazen first started, but I mean, when you're dealing with a partner that wants to destroy you, is not interested in giving you a single win, is just interested. Like I mean, near the end of Yasser Arafat's term, they were just firing like shells directly at like the house he was living in. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
pretty hard. It's pretty hard, but we gotta I think we need to accept and be aware of the facts on the ground right now, which is they really don't have much popular support. I mean, I would support elections in Gaza and the West Bank
Mhm.
to elect another uh, political movement that maybe would be you have a better chance of like achieving peace. But
Mhm.
I think that's another thing that people don't realize is really like the two-state solution's been dead for over a decade too, at least. I mean, when it's been undermined constantly by constant growth in settlements. Personally, like I've felt that the a one-state solution, one person, one vote, full democracy is the real only solution there because the God places like Gaza and the West Bank they've had everything taken from them. Their water, their resources. I mean, they would not be viable states in their current form. I don't
Well,
think.
this is the thing, is that you have to just look at it from the perspective, it seems to me, not necessarily of imagining the end outcomes and doing, political state formation design. Like, well, who are we? I mean, it's the principles. I mean, what you articulated are the principles of democracy, of equality, of justice, of human rights. That's what we adhere to. And if you apply those, then you're going to have to accord full democratic political rights to everybody who lives in the territory. That's the only way, really, to guarantee security. If Israel is so concerned about security, really, ultimately, the security lies in justice, fairness, and equality with those you live in society, with
Yeah,
in
and
this.
hopefully some reconciliation mixed in at the end there too, but only under
That's
certain
right.
conditions. You can't reconcile until the actual violence is stopped. You know.
Right. Right. Agreed. And I think the other component of this is mentioning that Hamas actually won elections. I mean, the ANC was also regarded as beyond the politically acceptable, but ultimately the South Africans had to deal with the political organization that represented the people that they needed to conclude an agreement with. And so uh, it's just foolishness at this point to continue to pretend that we're talking about a normal political situation.
Mm,
Obviously we're not. And as you pointed out, Gaza, West Bank, especially under blockade in this subordinate position without control of its own borders, these could never be viable states on their own. The two-state solution has indeed been foreclosed by the use of the Oslo process in an incredibly cynical way from the very outset
mm,
of continuing to change facts on the ground while supposedly undergoing peace negotiations. I mean, that
yeah.
just showed and proved that from the outset, this was meant to be a way of pacifying rather than concluding a peace. It
Mm.
was a way of pacifying the
And it was
Palestinians.
a death of by a thousand cuts,
That's
correct?
right. And
Yeah.
that pacification didn't ultimately work. It hasn't worked.
No.
Um, so this is where we are.
I
Where we're at.
I also wanted to ask you. I haven't researched this, and it's something I've heard about before. I know. I mean, and people in Americans would understand this dynamic as well. A huge proportion of the Palestinian population has either been in prison or is currently in some form of prison. We can understand why why this would be a fact. And
Hmm.
I know that there was quite a strong movement within the prisons of leaders within the resistance movements and just other Palestinians in prison, and that they were kind of forming like a little bit of a leadership cadre from within the prison system. Have you heard anything about that during this current crisis?
I haven't actually. That's an interesting point. That has sort of dropped a little bit off of my radar as well.
I'll have to look that
I'm
up.
thinking of people like Marwan al-Barghouti, who during a period represented some sort of critical counterweight to the Palestinian Authority, but
Mm,
who was not part of Hamas, but was, a different
mm,
kind of grouping. And because was in prison, had developed, network there and developed at least some bona fides and trust in the wider community, was beginning to develop, it seemed like, another way, an alternative
yeah.
kind of political trend. I haven't heard much about that, but of course, the plight of Palestinian political prisoners is a huge one. And you find that even teenagers, people who are um, not considered legally responsible in normal, law,
Mm.
to be jailed without trial, and so
Absolutely.
on. That this is a huge problem, and it's a lot like, this is why I think the Black Lives Matter comes to resonate. Is when you
Mm.
start looking at the situation, it's very similar to the conditions of mass incarceration.
See,
Is that
that's a really positive thought because I've heard people criticize Black Lives Matter for not achieving enough material change, and some of its founders now owning like four houses and having these big careers. So it would be maybe in a way if it had inspired this movement elsewhere.
mm,
This is definitely I mean, it's a huge silver lining. Also, I think yeah, people don't realize how much the world has really changed since the last time the hostilities flared up.
since
The social
2014?
media
Yeah,
2014, like the social media world has really like gone into overdrive,
yeah.
and I think people are getting older and they've seen the same narratives for long enough, and they've seen them really just like just drilled right into the stone. we've,
Hmm.
we've read the same article on the BBC 100 times in the last 20 years, and it hasn't changed. If anything, it's just gotten more of the same. And I think people have inherently started to like kind of get a sense that, you know what, we can't actually buy this kind of um, this algorithmic narrative that we've just always been faced with.
That's a great word, the algorithmic narrative, because in some ways I see repetition surrounding us in our politics all the time. I mean, even like
Very
the election of
frustrating.
Biden is a kind of repetition of a previous neoliberal era that has proven so incredibly frustrating. I think that's something that's really aggravating. There's been so many opportunities where there could really have been decisive change. 2008 with the, economic collapse, the bubble, then the upsurge of Black Lives Matter, and then we've had it again. And, we seem to be, caught in these repeated cycles and patterns that show really that the system cannot provide under its current terms, and structures cannot provide the solutions. It can only,
but we only see that when it's been repeated enough that it's become
yeah,
ad nauseum, that it's become like just pure pablum. We need to see these. Sometimes you need to see the narrative repeated so long, so many times over such a period of time to make that realization.
and I think
Which
that
is
has
it's very disturbing when you get to that point, because the kind of intensity and the rate of that repetition can also be a thing as well. And yeah, like last I checked, human beings were good at of several things, one of them being pattern recognition.
Mhm,
So when
mhm.
I've read the same article for 30 years on this
Yeah.
topic in the BBC, and I see the fact that the world has actually changed, I think it's a really disturbing thing for a lot of people to make that realization. It certainly has been for me.
I think I think that's well said, because I think we're in an era where those who have been in power for a long time think that they can continue to recycle the same discourse, the same line, the
Yeah.
same propaganda over and over again. They haven't caught up to the fact that people are fed up. The younger generation is asking a lot more questions and is not taking as given many of the presumptions and the terms of how reality, and especially political reality, have typically been described. And so I'm hopeful about that, that it seems that many more people this round is not 2014 Gaza. There are a few things that are different. The attempts to try and portray and represent it as just the same thing, that this truce is all that is needed. And I think that's the key point, is that, this truce is held up as some big accomplishment. But now people know it doesn't solve anything. We have to actually solve the real problem. The problem is not that there was a flare up and that, Gaza was bombarded and there were Hamas rockets, and we just need a ceasefire to end that kind of trading of, military blows. No, that has led, we've gone through this cycle more than once, but 2014 was almost exactly the same situation. And, people, I think, are recognizing that something more fundamental has to change. That's my hope out of this, is that at least something positive is percolating in solidarity movements, and that even if many of these governments in the region that historically at least paid lip service, to the Palestinian cause, and have stopped doing even that with these normalization and economic treaty relationships, that at least broadly speaking, in terms of solidarity, where I think it really counts, which is in the United States, for example, and in
Mm-hmm.
Western Europe, that there is a younger generation. There are Jews, who are questioning some of the principles of Zionism, and certainly feeling that, after going through Black Lives Matter, after going through the, era of Trump, that the symmetries between this kind of military occupation and police state racism, that these are forms of racism, they're forms of kind of settler colonial dysfunction, and that you have these neo-fascist leaders, whether it's in the U.S. or it's in Israel, that need to be challenged and need to go. I think that has changed the dynamic a little bit, and it's the global solidarity movements that now I think BDS is really back on the table for many people. We just read an article that Norwegian I'm forgetting, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway is divesting from two Israeli companies for being, violators of international law, and that poses certain kinds of risks that they don't want to be a part of because of those crimes against humanity. That's what we're talking about when it comes to divestment. If
Yeah.
the
Well,
world's largest sovereign wealth
yeah.
fund, divest, that is big.
Well, here's almost, it's almost a depressing thought, but it's also somewhat hopeful in a weird way. Like, I think people taking action to change the status quo, it's gone beyond, I think, in people's minds at large, that it has to be done because it's a moral question, because it's immoral for things to stay the way they are. I think people are also beginning to realize it's fucking impractical too, because we're just going to come back and have the same problems,
Exactly.
perhaps, or worse. And from a
Right.
practical standpoint of us just reasonably looking at the world and doing things like managing risk, the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, exactly, they want to manage their risk as well. And obviously Norway has a long tradition of being kind of a peace kind of obsessed, or like a supportive of peace kind of nation. I mean, the Oslo Accords, that's in Norway, right? Yeah, there you go.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's true.
So,
It was an Oslo Nobel
so
Peace Prize,
yeah.
these kinds of things.
But I
But
mean, even if they're sitting there looking at doing the calculus, I mean, people could just realize, like, from a practical standpoint, people living in safety and security and dignity with some form of economic prospect is just the way it should be, if we want to avoid creating all manner of problems, whether it's the rise of the far right, whether it's mob violence where people are just being pushed out of their homes by others, or riot police cracking people's skulls with their batons. I mean, all of these things are symptoms of that lack, ultimately, on one level.
yes,
you
yes,
know?
yes. Well, I like that you mentioned the practical reason here. And I think that's what's even in some ways more hopeful, because these are savvy assessors of financial risk, of political risk. And quite apart from the moral question, which I wouldn't expect a sovereign wealth fund to be particularly seized with,
Mhm.
even if they are in Norway, and
And they're
and all.
nice, you can be
Yeah,
nice, but
they can be nice. Yeah, but the point is that they see it as a risk because they're looking around and seeing that there are fewer and fewer, uh, willing partners in tolerating and overlooking, these sorts of crimes against humanity and violations of international law. When it's only the United States that 4 times is preventing in the UN Security Council a resolution to call for a ceasefire when all the other countries are doing so. It begin and that there are major protests in the United States and other Western capitals, that perhaps the era of impunity may not extend forever.
Well, last I checked, impunity was not a good thing. Impunity was on the list of bad things.
Right.
Pretty sure impunity, generally 99.9% of the time, is either the result of or the precursor to something bad happening.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
now listen, Adnan, I'm so glad we got on mic to talk about it. I know I want to be mindful of the time because you've been on mic actually for a few hours yourself here.
Oh
But
yes.
would you be able to come back maybe like later in the week and we'll continue the discussion? I think that would be really fun.
Yeah, that would be fun. I always enjoy these conversations so much, Isaac. You
Yeah,
got your finger on the pulse, and I love the back and forth. It really sparks some good, interesting ideas in the dynamic. So let's do it again.
likewise. Yeah, let's get something for later this week on the calendar. Okay, Adnan. Well, thank you so much for all the wonderful work. Much appreciated. People could follow you where?
At on Twitter at Adnan A Hussein, Husain. Check out my podcast, The Mujlis, if you're interested in the Middle East Islamic world. I'm actually going to be interviewing the author Timothy Brennan of a new biography of the great Palestinian scholar and dissident Edward Said. So
Oh,
look out for
fantastic.
that. Yeah, look out for that
Wow.
the first week of June. That should be, a
Wow.
really fun discussion on a very interesting biography of an absolutely vital figure in intellectual history, political history of this cause, and on so many interesting issues, besides being, of course, a wonderful literary scholar as well. So,
Absolutely. But just kind of actually an endlessly fascinating man, Edward
yes,
Said. I
oh,
mean, I was
absolutely.
always, I never cease to be surprised by new avenues to look at about his life.
Yes,
I'll definitely be
I
looking
miss
forward to that.
his voice so much during these kinds of times because
Of
he was
course.
such a brilliant commentator, and I actually think that there's been great scholarship, but I still absolutely love The Question of Palestine, a very important book he wrote. I still think it's one of the most amazing works
Mm.
on the question of Palestine. And so do check that out as it comes up. Listen to me on Guerrilla History. We have a great episode out just this last week on Indigenous history in the U.S. with Nick Estes, author. He's the Red Nation podcast. podcaster with his collective, as well as the author of Our History is the Future. And I also had an interesting conversation on guerrilla history about the One Kingdom solution, the interconfessional marriage proposal that was made as part of the negotiations to try and end the Third Crusade, that I think had some very interesting analogies with the contemporary situation that I discussed with the fellows on guerrilla history. So look
Wow.
out for those things.
Fantastic stuff. Yeah, and thank you so much to all of our patrons. We got a new patron just today. Thank you so much, K-Man. We have a K-Man on both podcasts now as a patron. So much love to you guys. Follow us at Pod Rule on Twitter. And yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation maybe Thursday or Friday, or if not, then in the weekend for sure. We'll
Sounds
fit it
great.
in. Okay, thank you so much,
Take it
Adnan.
easy.
Much love.
Bye.
Bye.